We are embarking on a meticulously detailed, hour-by-hour investigation today. Our objective is to comprehensively examine the life, the sweeping and labyrinthine investigation, and the highly controversial death of American writer Danny Casolaro.
We will track the precise chronological timeline of events, beginning with his early biographical details and proceeding methodically right up through modern-day developments.
Right. And the premise we are exploring with you today is exceptionally dark. I mean, we are talking about a freelance journalist who is found deceased in a West Virginia hotel room just days before he claims he is going to expose a massive, sprawling international cabal.
A network he referred to as the Octopus.
Exactly. According to the materials he was compiling, this alleged network was involved in stolen government software, covert weapons testing on sovereign land, and international election interference.
The information we are utilizing for this comprehensive analysis comes directly from encyclopedic sources, compiled biographical archives, contemporary news articles from the period, and declassified investigative documents.
And before we get any further, I must issue a very clear and absolute disclaimer to you, the listener. This source material contains highly politically charged elements.
Specifically regarding Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, the 1980 election, the October surprise, and the Iran-Contra affair.
Yes. We hold no personal opinions on these matters. We take no political sides. We are merely reporting the explosive claims and the equally staunch denials exactly as they appear in the historical record. We are acting purely as impartial conduits of the source material.
That framework is absolutely essential for an objective analysis. The source texts present a complex chronological matrix of allegations, legal disputes, and forensic data. My function will be to provide the strict chronological facts, the technical realities of the software systems involved, the forensic pathology findings, and the operational parameters of the intelligence concepts mentioned in the literature.
And to understand the sheer magnitude of the investigation he undertook, you really have to understand the man himself first. You have to look at his psychological profile, his background, to see the contrast with his later descent into this all-consuming conspiracy.
Joseph Daniel Casolaro was born on June 16, 1947, in Fort Meade, Maryland.
He grew up in McLean, Virginia. And this geographical detail is actually quite significant. McLean is not just a standard American suburb. It is heavily associated with the intelligence community and government operations. It is practically the backyard of the Central Intelligence Agency.
He was raised in a Catholic household, the son of an obstetrician, and was the second of 6 children.
It was a large family, but one that experienced profound tragedy early on.
The biographical archives indicate significant psychological stressors in his family history that require clinical acknowledgement. One of his siblings fell ill and died shortly after birth. This type of early familial loss establishes a baseline of trauma within the family dynamic.
And it didn't stop there.
No. The records show that his younger sister, Lisa, died of a drug overdose in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco in 1971.
That is a massive weight for a family to carry.
When analyzing a psychological profile, the impact of sibling loss, particularly a sudden and traumatic death like an overdose in a highly publicized, chaotic counterculture environment, often creates long-lasting reverberations.
It reframes his later obsession with drug cartels and organized crime, doesn't it?
For a surviving sibling, the realization that an underworld of illicit narcotics can completely destroy a family member often acts as a catalyst for a lifelong fixation on criminal networks and systemic failures. It primes the neurological pathways to seek out and attempt to untangle hidden destructive structures.
Despite these tragedies, Casolaro moved forward with his education and personal life. He attended Providence College until 1968. He married Terrell Pace, who was a former Miss Virginia.
They had a son together named Trey.
The marriage lasted for 10 years before ending in divorce, and interestingly, Casolaro was ultimately granted legal custody of his son. Raising a child as a single father while pursuing a highly unconventional career path requires a certain level of tenacity, and his interests were remarkably eclectic.
He was involved in amateur boxing, he raised purebred Arabian horses, he wrote poetry and short stories.
He even had a novel published. It was titled The Ice King, released by Whitmore Publishing Co. He was, in many ways, a Renaissance man, bouncing between intensely physical pursuits like boxing, highly cerebral creative pursuits like poetry.
Those diverse pursuits indicate a highly active, perhaps restless intellect, capable of intense focus on varied subjects. Clinically speaking, the dichotomy between amateur boxing, which requires immediate, hyper-focused physical reaction and risk tolerance, and the writing of poetry, which requires isolated, abstract cognitive processing, suggests a personality comfortable operating at behavioral extremes.
His early professional life reflects that too. His early curriculum vitae shows an initial foray into investigative journalism.
The targets of his early inquiries included the Soviet naval presence in Cuba, the Castro intelligence network, and Chinese communist opium smuggling operations into the United States.
Those are not small-town beats.
Yeah.
He was going straight for high-level international intelligence and geopolitical topics.
It demonstrates an early predisposition toward investigating state-level actors and covert operations. He was inherently drawn to the mechanics of international power and clandestine logistics.
Though the compiled articles note, it remains unclear exactly how much of this early research was actually published, or if it remained in the compilation phase. He had this early taste for the clandestine, but then he pivoted. Toward the end of the 1970s, he stepped away from journalism.
He moved into the business sector, specifically acquiring a series of computer industry trade publications.
He spent about a decade in that sector before he began selling them off toward the end of the 1980s. This career pivot is crucial because it provided him with two vital assets. First, financial capital from the sale of these publications. Second, incredibly deep, highly specialized contacts within the burgeoning information technology sector.
And it was exactly those information technology contacts that would draw him back into the world of investigative journalism in early 1990.
They pointed him toward a massive, incredibly complex legal battle that would become the bait for his fatal investigation. This was the Inslaw case.
The Inslaw case is fundamentally a dispute over intellectual property and software engineering, specifically a program called PROMIS.
Which stands for Prosecutors Management Information System.
Correct. It was developed by William A. Hamilton, the founder of Inslaw. Hamilton had previously worked at the United States Justice Department. To understand the gravity of this dispute, one must understand the state of data management prior to this software.
Right, because in the late 1970s and early 1980s, law enforcement agencies and court systems operated almost entirely on physical paper trails.
Tracking the relationship between a suspect, multiple criminal cases across different jurisdictions, physical evidence, and court dates required manual cross-referencing of index cards and filing cabinets. It was highly inefficient and prone to immense data loss.
So if a criminal crossed a state line, or if a piece of evidence was relevant to two different investigations handled by two different prosecutors, it was incredibly easy for the connection to be completely missed simply because the paperwork was sitting in two different physical buildings.
That is accurate. The core function of the PROMIS software was to digitize and automate that relational data management. It was engineered to organize the vast, overwhelming amounts of administrative data generated by law enforcement. It was essentially an early, highly sophisticated relational database.
In the context of 1980s computing, a system capable of effectively cross-referencing and managing multi-jurisdictional legal data in real time was revolutionary.
It represented a quantum leap in administrative capability, making it exceptionally valuable property.
And this is where the conflict begins. After Hamilton left his position at the Justice Department, he founded his company and refined this software. But Hamilton alleged that the government essentially stole PROMIS. He claimed they took his finalized proprietary software and distributed it illegally across various government agencies, robbing him and his company of millions of dollars in rightful licensing revenue.
The Justice Department completely denied this assertion. Their stance was that they owned the software because Hamilton had developed the foundational elements of it while he was employed by them, essentially classifying it as a work for hire.
It turned into an absolute legal roller coaster, a labyrinth of litigation that dragged on for years.
The chronological timeline of the litigation is extensive and heavily documented in the public record. The legal disputes commenced in 1983. In 1988, a federal bankruptcy judge issued a staggering 300-page ruling in favor of Inslaw.
And in this ruling, the judge stated explicitly that the Justice Department had taken the software through, quote, trickery, fraud, and deceit.
A judicial finding of that magnitude against the United States Department of Justice is highly irregular and significant. This was a massive legal victory for Hamilton, and this decision was subsequently upheld by a federal district court.
However, the trajectory of the case reversed sharply when it was overturned on appeal in 1991.
Yes, primarily on jurisdictional and procedural grounds, rather than a refutation of the core facts regarding the software's origin. The prolonged, highly contentious nature of this litigation created an environment ripe for speculation and the introduction of secondary, far more severe allegations.
Those secondary allegations are what elevated this from a simple software dispute into a sprawling international conspiracy theory. If it had just stayed a dispute about unpaid royalties, Danny Casolaro might have written a standard financial expose and moved on.
It became about what the software was allegedly being used for once the government had it in their possession.
This brings us to the backdoor theory, which became the absolute focal point for Casolaro. I think we need to break down exactly what a backdoor means in this context, because it sounds like a movie trope, but the technical reality of it is terrifying.
The technical mechanics of a software backdoor involve inserting hidden, undocumented code into a program's architecture. This code functions as a covert access point. It allows an unauthorized party, specifically the entity that programmed the backdoor, to bypass all normal cryptographic authentication procedures.
So the host system operates under the assumption that its firewall and password protocols are completely secure.
Exactly. The local administrators are entirely unaware that a parallel access route exists. The allegation in the Inslaw case was that the PROMIS software was secretly modified to include such a backdoor before it was distributed further.
And if you apply that to law enforcement and intelligence databases, the implications are staggering.
The strategic value of this operation, if true, would be historically unprecedented. By selling or providing this compromised PROMIS software to dozens of foreign governments, allied intelligence agencies, and even adversarial nations for their own internal data management, the entity controlling the backdoor would theoretically have unfettered, covert access to the classified intelligence and law enforcement data of those purchasing nations.
It represents a theoretical masterstroke of signals intelligence gathering. It transforms a data organization tool into the ultimate global espionage apparatus.
It is the ultimate Trojan horse.
You sell a foreign country the exact tool they desperately need to organize their most sensitive state secrets, their spy rosters, their military logistics, their criminal informants, and you build in a secret window so you can sit in Washington and read everything they type. This theory is what truly hooked Danny Casolaro.
And the man who introduced him to the darkest elements of this theory is a figure named Michael Riconosciuto.
Casolaro was connected to him through a man named Jeff Steinberg, who was a top aide in the LaRouche organization. The journalist Ron Rosenbaum described Riconosciuto in incredibly vivid terms. He called him a rogue scientist, weapons designer, platinum miner, and alleged crystal meth manufacturer.
This is the individual who becomes Casolaro's primary guide into this specific narrative. Riconosciuto introduced allegations that exponentially expanded the scope of Casolaro's inquiry far beyond software piracy.
The most significant of these initial introductions was the October surprise claim.
According to Riconosciuto's statements to Bill Hamilton, Riconosciuto himself, along with a man named Earl Bryan, who was a director of the government consulting firm Hadron, Incorporated, allegedly facilitated a massive financial transaction in 1980. Riconosciuto claimed they paid $40 million to Iranian officials.
And the stated objective of this alleged payment:
to persuade the Iranian government to deliberately delay the release of American hostages held in Tehran until after the conclusion of the 1980 presidential election. The theoretical motive, posited by Riconosciuto, was to assist Ronald Reagan in securing the presidency against incumbent Jimmy Carter by preventing Carter from achieving a pre-election diplomatic victory.
And here I must pause and reiterate our absolute neutrality to you, the listener. We are strictly conveying the historical allegations made by Michael Riconosciuto as they are documented in the compiled articles. We do not endorse these political claims.
Earl Bryan, who was a close friend of then Attorney General Ed Meese and had worked for Reagan during his time as governor of California, firmly and categorically denied any involvement whatsoever in either the October surprise or the Inslaw software case.
We simply report the presence of these claims in the files Casolaro was obsessively reviewing.
The historical record reflects Bryan's categorical denials. However, Riconosciuto claimed that in exchange for Earl Bryan's assistance in this alleged international election interference, Bryan was subsequently allowed to profit from the illegal, covert distribution of the compromised PROMIS software.
Riconosciuto's claims did not stop there, did they?
They did not. On March 21, 1991, he escalated his allegations by submitting a formal sworn affidavit to the court in the ongoing Inslaw litigation. In this legal document, under penalty of perjury, he swore that he personally executed the backdoor modifications to the PROMIS software at the behest of the Justice Department.
Furthermore, he claimed that these highly classified modifications were conducted at a specific, highly unusual location, the Cabazon Indian Reservation located near Indio, California.
The strategic value of utilizing a reservation lies entirely in the complex legal concept of tribal sovereignty. Native American reservations operate under unique jurisdictional frameworks within the United States. In many respects, they possess sovereign immunity, meaning they operate as independent nations regarding certain regulatory and law enforcement oversights.
So the enforcement of standard United States, local, state, and even certain federal laws is highly problematic, restricted, or entirely inapplicable on reservation land without specific tribal consent or a specific federal mandate.
It creates a jurisdictional void. Riconosciuto alleged that this legal isolation was deliberately exploited to establish an autonomous zone for covert operations. He claimed that he did not just work on software there. He alleged he worked on advanced, highly destructive weapons programs on the reservation for the Wackenhut Corporation, a massive private security and defense contractor.
Specifically, he cited the development and testing of fuel-air explosives. For those who aren't familiar with military munitions, can you explain the physics of what that actually is? Because testing something like that on domestic soil seems insane.
A fuel-air explosive, also known as a thermobaric weapon, operates on a different mechanical principle than standard conventional explosives. Standard explosives contain both fuel and an oxidizer within the casing. A thermobaric weapon relies almost entirely on oxygen from the surrounding atmosphere.
So how does the detonation process work?
The munition consists of a container of highly volatile energetic fuel and two separate explosive charges. The primary charge detonates, bursting the container and dispersing the fuel into a massive, highly combustible aerosol cloud that mixes with atmospheric oxygen. Fractions of a second later, the secondary charge ignites the cloud.
And the result of that ignition?
The result is a massive, sustained blast wave that possesses a significantly longer duration than a conventional explosive. The ignition consumes all available oxygen in the immediate vicinity, creating a localized vacuum, which leads to a devastating secondary effect as the surrounding air rushes back in at supersonic speeds to fill the void.
The overpressure generated by a fuel-air explosive is extraordinarily lethal, capable of destroying reinforced structures and causing catastrophic barotrauma to human physiology, essentially rupturing internal organs.
Riconosciuto's claim that private contractors were developing and testing munitions of this magnitude on sovereign tribal land to evade federal oversight was a staggering allegation.
So Riconosciuto is painting a picture of a domestic autonomous zone where international software espionage and the testing of thermobaric weapons are happening completely off the books. But the timeline of Riconosciuto's involvement takes a very sharp, sudden turn right after he makes these explosive claims official.
He signed that sworn affidavit on March 21, 1991. Just 8 days later, on March 29, 1991, Riconosciuto was arrested.
And the charges are not related to espionage or perjury. He is arrested for distributing methamphetamine and methadone. He is later convicted and sentenced to prison. From his perspective, he claimed this arrest was a direct setup, a fabricated charge executed by the intelligence apparatus to completely silence him and discredit his testimony in the Inslaw case.
The chronological proximity of the affidavit submission and the subsequent narcotics arrest is a factual matter of record. The validity of his claim that it was a retaliatory setup remains an unverified assertion, though it aligns with standard operational tactics used to neutralize a hostile witness by destroying their credibility through unrelated criminal charges.
Regardless of the truth of the arrest, the impact of Riconosciuto's overarching narrative on Danny Casolaro is thoroughly documented. The impact was absolute obsession.
In the summer of 1990, Casolaro had arranged to meet with Bill Hamilton to discuss the Inslaw story. During this interaction, Hamilton handed Casolaro a 12-page memo written by Michael Riconosciuto.
This memo detailed all of these staggering allegations: the back door, the October surprise, the Cabazon reservation, the weapons testing. The journalist Ron Rosenbaum wrote extensively about this exact moment, stating that the instant Casolaro got his hands on that 12-page memo, his life changed permanently.
Rosenbaum compared it to a covert ops version of the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, with the memo acting as a rulebook, and Michael Riconosciuto acting as the dungeon master,
leading Casolaro deeper and deeper into a completely absorbing, inescapable maze. Casolaro began to assemble what he believed was a grand unified theory of global corruption. He didn't just see a software dispute anymore. He saw a singular, monstrous entity orchestrating multiple global events. This is what he formally named the Octopus.
The theoretical construct of the octopus posited that an international cabal was the connective tissue between several seemingly disparate historical events. Casolaro believed this single hidden network connected the Inslaw PROMIS software theft, the Iran-Contra affair, the alleged October surprise, and the massive collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, commonly referred to as BCCI.
Let's unpack the BCCI connection, because that's a name that gets thrown around in 1980s history. But its actual function in this conspiracy theory is vital. Why would a journalist investigating software theft suddenly care about the closure of an international bank?
The Bank of Credit and Commerce International was once the seventh largest private bank in the world. However, investigations eventually revealed it operated effectively as an immense decentralized money laundering apparatus.
It was designed to actively circumvent regulatory oversight.
Correct. Utilizing incredibly complex corporate structures across multiple jurisdictions with strict bank secrecy laws. The source texts note that the closure of BCCI was intricately related to the operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. Intelligence agencies, by their nature, require mechanisms to fund covert operations entirely off the books without congressional oversight or public record.
BCCI provided the infrastructure for these untraceable financial transactions, facilitating everything from illegal arms sales to the funding of proxy wars. Casolaro theorized that the profits from the illegal sale of the PROMIS software were laundered through BCCI to fund the operations of the Octopus.
He was attempting to map the entire geopolitical underworld of the era, the financial logistics, the weapons procurement, the software architecture, the political maneuvering.
When you look at the sheer volume of data required to prove that, you begin to see the psychological toll this took on him. When investigators and other journalists later looked at the files Casolaro left behind, they didn't find a polished manuscript or a clearly outlined expose.
They found a chaotic, overwhelming archive.
There were old, yellowing newspaper clippings stacked everywhere. There were reams of handwritten notes that were incredibly difficult to read, filled with arrows connecting seemingly unrelated data points. He was obsessively collecting lists of names, former CIA officers, international arms dealers, foreign diplomats. It was a massive, tangled web of data.
David Korn, writing in The Nation, observed that Casolaro's papers showed he was heavily influenced by organizations like the Christic Institute,
which was a public interest law firm that was famously aggressive in pursuing sweeping conspiracy theories regarding the intelligence community.
Korn also noted that Casolaro was pulling material fed to him by a reporter connected to Lyndon LaRouche. Analytical assessments by contemporary journalists highlight the overwhelming nature of his research parameters.
Attempting to verify the clandestine financial logistics of BCCI, the software architecture of PROMIS, and the geopolitical maneuvering of the October surprise simultaneously is a monumental task.
David Korn concluded that Casolaro was, quote, in over his head, but was tenacious. Richard Fricker, writing in Wired magazine, utilized a geographical anomaly as a metaphor for Casolaro's mental state, stating that Casolaro had wandered into a Bermuda Triangle of spooks, guns, drugs, and organized crimes.
The sheer volume and complexity of the allegations he was attempting to synthesize would place extreme cognitive load on any single investigator operating without the logistical, legal, and editorial support of a major news institution.
He was a solitary individual attempting an institutional-level investigation.
He was completely untethered. And this brings us to the final week of his life. The timeline here is absolutely critical, and we need to walk through it methodically, hour by hour. We're looking at the periods from August 5 to August 9, 1991. The pressure seems to fundamentally fracture his behavior during these days.
On August 5, Casolaro made a phone call to a retired Army Criminal Investigation Division officer named Bill McCoy.
During this call, Casolaro made several highly dramatic, definitive claims. He stated that Time magazine had officially assigned him the story on the Octopus. He claimed he was actively working hand-in-hand with the famous investigative reporter Jack Anderson. He further asserted that publishers Little, Brown, and Time Warner had offered to finance the entire investigative effort.
Forensic fact-checking of those statements reveals them to be complete fabrications. The source material confirms that the publisher Little Brown had explicitly rejected his manuscript proposal regarding the Octopus over a month prior to that telephone conversation.
The assertions regarding formal assignments from Time magazine and a partnership with Jack Anderson were also demonstrably false.
Clinically analyzing this behavior, this pattern of disseminating fabricated professional credentials, indicates a state of severe distress. It suggests a deliberate strategy of deception designed to project authority, either to protect himself by appearing highly connected to major institutions or to convince reluctant sources that he possessed the institutional backing necessary to protect them.
Alternatively, it points to a severe psychological degradation, where the boundary between his aspirations for the project and objective reality was dissolving. It is the behavior of a desperate man trying to build a fortress out of lies to protect himself.
On that same day, August 5, his friend Ben Mason agreed to meet with him to discuss Casolaro's rapidly deteriorating finances.
A few days later, Casolaro showed Mason a meticulously detailed 22-point outline for his proposed book. But alongside this highly focused, organized outline, Casolaro was exhibiting signs of severe paranoia and physical exhaustion.
He complained bitterly about a literary agent who he felt had uselessly tied up his work for 18 months. Far more disturbingly, he reported to Mason that his sleep had been systematically disrupted for 3 consecutive months by late-night phone calls.
The report of sustained sleep deprivation over a 90-day period is a critical data point.
In the context of psychological warfare and covert operations, systematic sleep deprivation is a recognized, highly effective method of psychological harassment. It severely degrades cognitive function, emotional stability, and rational decision-making capabilities.
Without adequate REM sleep, a subject will naturally begin to exhibit symptoms of paranoia, disjointed thinking, and an inability to process information objectively.
If these calls were indeed occurring, as he reported, it represents a concerted effort to break his psychological endurance.
And the timeline accelerates. We move to August 8. Casolaro prepares to leave his home. A neighbor and his longtime housekeeper, named Olga, helps him pack. She recalls the exact details of his luggage. He packed a black leather tote bag and placed a very thick sheaf of investigative papers into a dark brown or black briefcase.
He tells Olga that he's leaving for several days to visit Martinsburg, West Virginia. He explicitly states his operational objective to her. He is going to Martinsburg to meet a source who has promised to provide an important missing piece to his story.
That brief interaction was the last time Olga ever saw him alive, and the events that unfolded at his house that day immediately after he left are absolutely chilling.
The record of incoming telephone communications to Casolaro's residence on August 8th, as reported by the housekeeper Olga to the Village Voice, constitutes a severe and unmistakable escalation in threatening behavior. I will list them chronologically.
Please do.
At approximately 9:00 a.m., Olga answered the phone, and a male caller stated directly, "I will cut his body and throw it to the sharks."
Less than an hour later, a different male voice called.
And stated simply, "Drop dead." This was followed by a third call, characterized by silence interspersed with background music, resembling a radio playing. A fourth call mirrored the third, with silent music. A fifth call, entirely silent, was received later that night.
This is a documented, methodical sequence of psychological intimidation directed at his residence while he was in transit, ensuring that a record of hostility was established. It is terrifying. It is the exact kind of intimidation tactic you would expect from the underworld he was investigating.
While those calls are happening at his home, Casolaro is arriving in West Virginia. The movements on August 9th, his last full day alive, are fragmented based on witness reports, but crucial to understanding his state of mind.
According to the Martinsburg Morning Journal, on the day before he was found dead, he ate at a local Pizza Hut. The interaction there is strangely poetic and completely out of place for a man who is supposedly terrified for his life. He reportedly told the waitress he liked her eyes and quoted lines from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby to her.
That specific behavioral anomaly is highly incongruous with a state of acute fear or imminent physical threat. Quoting classic literature to a stranger in a casual dining environment suggests a detached, almost romanticized state of mind, entirely divorced from the reality of the threats directed at his home that same morning.
We then move to the confirmed timeline of his professional meetings. At approximately 2:30 p.m. on August 9, he held a meeting with a Honeywell engineer named William Richard Turner at the Sheraton Hotel.
Turner later stated to investigators that he provided Casolaro with certain documents and they conversed for a few minutes. Subsequent witness reports indicate Casolaro spent the following hours at a local Martinsburg restaurant. A bartender at that establishment noted to police that Casolaro appeared lonely and deeply depressed.
The psychological whiplash here is intense. In the span of a few hours, he goes from quoting classic literature to a waitress with romantic charm, to conducting a brief exchange of documents with an engineer, to appearing profoundly lonely and depressed at a bar.
By 5 p.m., the police later learned Casolaro had moved and was seen at Heatherfield's, which is the cocktail lounge located inside the Sheraton Hotel where he was staying.
A waitress described seeing him there engaged in conversation with a man she characterized as maybe Arab or Iranian. We have absolutely no further identification of this individual. He exists purely as a description from a waitress. Then Casolaro returns to the vicinity of his hotel room.
The physical location is room 517. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Casolaro had a chance encounter in the hallway with Mike Looney, the individual renting the adjacent room.
They engaged in a casual conversation at 5:30 p.m. and interacted again at approximately 8:20 p.m.
According to Looney's formal statements to investigators, Casolaro explicitly confirmed his operational objective during these conversations, stating openly to his neighbor that he was there to meet a highly important source who would provide the necessary information to finally solve his case.
Casolaro specified the timeline, stating that this source was scheduled to arrive at his room by 9:00 p.m., and this is where the pivotal meeting seems to completely fall apart. Around that 9:00 p.m. hour, Casolaro excuses himself from Looney, saying he needs to go make a phone call.
He comes back a few minutes later, and his entire demeanor has changed. He tells Looney that his highly anticipated source might have blown him off.
Despite this crushing setback, Casolaro and Looney continue talking until about 9:00 p.m. At roughly 10:00 p.m., Casolaro leaves the hotel and is seen purchasing coffee at a nearby convenience store. This routine, mundane transaction of buying a cup of coffee is the absolute final confirmed sighting of Danny Casolaro alive.
We now transition to the morning of August 10, 1991, and the discovery of the body. The approach to this segment of the timeline must remain strictly forensic and clinical, analyzing the physical evidence as it was recorded.
At approximately noon, hotel housekeeping staff entered room 517 for routine service. They discovered Casolaro in the bathroom, situated within the bathtub.
The scene was noted in police reports to be exceptionally severe in its visual impact, to the extent that one of the responding housekeepers lost consciousness upon viewing the volume of blood present.
Walk us through the exact physical evidence found at the scene by the responding authorities.
The physical state of the deceased was an unclothed state within the bathtub. The medical cause of the severe blood loss was multiple deep lacerations to the wrists. Forensic counting of the wounds indicated 3 or 4 distinct, deep slashes on the right wrist, and 7 or 8 corresponding wounds on the left wrist.
Blood spatter was distributed extensively on the wall and the floor of the bathroom environment, indicating arterial spray.
Notably, there was no obstruction or stopper placed in the bathtub drain. Consequently, the bodily fluids and any residual bath water had entirely evacuated the basin down the plumbing system, resulting in a total loss of potential trace evidence or chemical residue within that fluid matrix.
And what specific items were recovered in direct proximity to his body?
Items retrieved directly from beneath the body included an empty Milwaukee beer can, 2 white plastic trash can liners, and a single-edge razor blade. In the immediate vicinity of the bathtub, personnel located a half-empty bottle of wine. Further inspection of the bathroom scene yielded a small package containing 4 additional razor blades, which were still sealed in their individual paper envelopes.
If we step out of the bathroom, what did the rest of room 517 look like? Was it ransacked? Was his briefcase with the papers there?
Aside from the bathroom, the rest of room 517 was remarkably undisturbed. It was clean and entirely orderly. Forensic analysis showed absolutely no signs of a physical struggle. There was no evidence of forced entry into the room. The door lock and frame were intact.
However, the dark briefcase and the thick sheaf of papers reported by his housekeeper Olga were completely missing from the room. What remained was a piece of writing left behind. On the desk, investigators found a legal pad and a pen. A single page had been torn from this pad, and a message was written on it.
The forensic documentation of that note is precise.
I'm going to read that note verbatim. It read, "To those who I love the most, please forgive me for the worst possible thing I could have done. Most of all, I'm sorry to my son. I know deep down inside that God will let me in."
Based on this note, the presence of alcohol in the room, the locked door, the lack of defensive wounds, and the lack of any signs of a struggle, the Martinsburg police made a rapid assessment. They immediately judged the case to be a straightforward suicide.
The procedural response by the local authorities involved contacting law enforcement in Fairfax, Virginia, to arrange for the formal notification of Casolaro's next of kin.
The initial autopsy was conducted 4 days later, on August 14, 1991, at West Virginia University. The coroner's findings confirmed exsanguination, severe and terminal blood loss as the mechanical cause of death.
By analyzing the state of rigor mortis and lividity, The estimated time of death was calculated to be between 1 and 4 hours prior to discovery by the housekeeping staff.
This places the fatal event roughly between 8:00 a.m. and 11:00 a.m. on the morning of August 10.
But almost immediately, the narrative of a simple, tragic suicide began to fray. The anomalies started piling up. The day after his body was found, Dan Bischoff, who was an editor at the Village Voice, received an anonymous phone call alerting him to Casolaro's death before it was widely public knowledge.
The dissemination of this information prior to official public release indicates that internal knowledge of the event was circulating within certain unidentified networks.
Rumors started exploding across the journalistic community. There were whispers about mafia involvement. There were wild, completely unsubstantiated stories circulating that the undertaker who handled the body was actually a CIA employee hired to clean up an assassination. The paranoia that Casolaro had been writing about was suddenly infectious.
And the funeral itself provided one of the most structurally anomalous moments of this entire historical record.
The visual parameters of the anomaly that occurred at the funeral are documented by investigative journalists Ridgway and Vaughn. As the graveside ceremony was concluding, a highly decorated military officer wearing a formal United States Army dress uniform arrived at the site in a limousine.
He was accompanied by a second individual dressed in civilian clothing.
The military officer bypassed the mourners, walked directly to the coffin just before it was interred, placed a medal upon the lid, executed a formal military salute, and immediately departed the grounds in the waiting vehicle.
Neither the military officer nor the civilian companion were recognized by the family or anyone in attendance. To this day, their identities and the specific nature of the medal remain entirely unverified in the public record.
A completely unidentified military officer arriving in a limousine to leave a medal on the casket of a journalist who was actively investigating a massive covert weapons and software conspiracy. You cannot script a more haunting image. It is the kind of event that ensures a story never dies. But the investigation into his death did not stop at the graveyard. The anomalies demanded further, rigorous scrutiny.
About 5 months later, due to immense public and familial pressure, in January 1992, a second autopsy was ordered.
The secondary post-mortem examination was conducted by Dr. Frost of the West Virginia State Medical Examiner's Office.
Dr. Frost's conclusions reaffirmed the initial verdict of suicide resulting from exsanguination. However, the secondary examination provided additional physiological data that complicated the narrative. It revealed physical evidence of the early stages of multiple sclerosis, although the severity of the condition at the time of death was classified as minor.
A comprehensive toxicology analysis detected traces of 3 substances in his system: antidepressants, acetaminophen, and alcohol.
Crucially, Dr. Frost formally concluded in his report, quote, "There was nothing present in any way that could have incapacitated Casolaro, so he would have been incapable of struggling against an assailant, let alone been sufficient to kill him."
So the medical establishment held incredibly firm to the suicide ruling. They concluded he was physically capable of fighting back, he wasn't drugged into unconsciousness, and he died by his own hand. But the family and other journalists strongly, vehemently pushed back against this conclusion.
They pointed to a very specific, well-documented psychological trait. Casolaro had an extreme, documented fear of blood. He was highly squeamish about even basic medical blood tests.
To his family, the idea that a man with a clinical phobia of blood would choose to end his life by making up to 12 incredibly deep, painful slashes to his own wrists was psychologically incomprehensible.
From a clinical standpoint, overcoming a severe phobia to execute self-termination in that specific manner is highly anomalous. Furthermore, the mechanics of inflicting 7 or 8 deep lacerations on one wrist and then transferring the razor blade to a severely injured, bleeding hand suffering from severed tendons to inflict 3 or 4 additional deep lacerations on the opposite wrist requires an extraordinary degree of sustained physical commitment and pain tolerance.
While not physically impossible, it is statistically rare in forensic profiles of self-inflicted wounds. And because of those anomalies, alternative theories flourished.
Ron Reisenbaum, writing in Vanity Fair, put forward an alternative operational theory. He speculated that Casolaro might have intentionally engineered his own suicide to visually mimic a murder.
The logic being that if his death looked like a brutal assassination triggered by his research, it would force the authorities and other investigative journalists to aggressively investigate the octopus theory after he was gone. He essentially theorized that Casolaro sacrificed himself to force the world to look at the conspiracy.
That theory introduces a complex psychological maneuver. positing self-termination not out of despair, but as a final, calculated investigative tactic. Concurrently, severe allegations of institutional suppression began to emerge regarding the official investigation into his death.
Investigative reports indicated that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had provided demonstrably misleading information to Congress concerning the depth and scope of their inquiry into Casolaro.
Furthermore, it was documented that members of a specific FBI task force assigned to review the case actively questioned the conclusion of suicide in December 1992. They formally recommended further investigation.
The source texts note that this expression of institutional doubt was highly significant. Taking a position contrary to the established local ruling and higher bureau directives at that time carried severe professional risks for those agents.
And then there is the issue of the missing investigative files.
Right. Discrepancies arose regarding internal FBI record-keeping. Bureau documents eventually revealed that certain investigative files pertaining to Casolaro were being deliberately withheld from public release under exemptions.
This internal admission directly contradicted previous public assertions made by the FBI that the files were simply missing or lost. The friction between the official ruling of a simple suicide and the documented evasive behavior of federal institutions fueled intense public skepticism.
The case became deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness of the 1990s. In 1993, the massive television show Unsolved Mysteries featured his story, bringing it to millions of living rooms. During that episode, they interviewed Elliot Richardson, a former attorney general in the Nixon administration.
Richardson's statements provided a high-level institutional validation of the gravity of the underlying claims.
Richardson made a staggering statement on national television. He said that this affair, at its outer reaches, entails a conspiracy far more sinister than anything revealed in Watergate. When a former attorney general compares your case favorably to Watergate in terms of corruption, it cements the story in history. The narrative continued to resonate for decades, even inspiring a 2008 play called Danny Casolaro Died for You, written by his cousin, Dominic Orlando.
The narrative framework, however, shifted significantly due to modern breakthroughs. Specifically, the massive explosion of renewed interest generated by the 2024 Netflix documentary series, American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders.
This project didn't just rehash the old facts or interview the same people. The filmmakers unearthed completely new, highly classified evidence through the Freedom of Information Act.
The methodology employed by the documentary investigators, Zachary Treitz and Christian Hansen, involved filing persistent Freedom of Information Act requests, specifically targeting the closed case files of the Martinsburg Police Department.
Initially, these legal requests were denied under the premise that the Department of Justice had assumed federal jurisdiction over the materials.
However, when the documents were eventually secured after legal pressure, they revealed critical data points that directly contradicted the original public statements issued by the police in 1991.
The primary explosive discovery within these newly released files was a previously undisclosed witness statement.
Crucially, this statement was accompanied by a physical sketch generated by a police artist. This sketch depicted an individual reported by the witness to have been present in Casolaro's hotel room on the night in question.
Let's stop right there. The Martinsburg police stated publicly in 1991 that Casolaro was alone, the room was locked from the inside, and there was absolutely no evidence of anyone else being present. But this FOIA request proved they had a witness statement and a police sketch of a man in his room, and they buried it. And this sketch is the absolute bombshell of the entire modern investigation, because the sketch eerily, undeniably matches the physical description of a specific man named Joseph Queller.
According to interviews conducted with his own son in the documentary, Queller was a specialist. His exact operational expertise was human infiltration and the extraction of information.
He was a master of discovering exactly what a target knows, who they have told, and what they don't know. He was highly recognized within intelligence circles for his advanced skills in psychological warfare.
The introduction of Joseph Queller fundamentally alters the analytical framework of the case. The connection to Casolaro is not based entirely on a physical resemblance in a police sketch. Based on subsequent witness interviews, a friend of Casolaro's confirmed that Danny had a brief but highly significant interaction with Joseph Queller at a local bar weeks prior to his death in West Virginia.
During that interaction, Casolaro actively and openly shared his knowledge of the Octopus with Queller. He revealed his preliminary findings regarding international intelligence agencies, organized crime, the Inslaw software, and government corruption to a man whose precise, documented specialty was psychological infiltration and the neutralization of human targets.
The introduction of this physical evidence and corroborating witness testimony establishes an entirely new operational theory. It posits that Casolaro was deliberately targeted for elimination by the entities overseeing the covert taxpayer-funded operations he was attempting to expose.
The presence of an infiltration specialist equipped with advanced psychological warfare training suggests a sophisticated methodology.
This methodology was likely designed to accomplish three objectives. First, to extract his compiled data to determine the extent of his knowledge. Second, to apply extreme psychological pressure, such as the documented sleep deprivation and threatening phone calls to drive him to self-termination. Or third, to execute a kinetic elimination, a physical murder, meticulously staged to resemble a suicide by exsanguination.
When you look at the sheer weight of these sources, the encyclopedic data, the court rulings, the declassified files, you see the terrifying trajectory of a single reporter. He pulled at the thread of a mundane, bureaucratic software dispute regarding PROMIS, and the fabric of reality seemed to completely unravel into a labyrinth of alleged international intelligence crimes. He found himself navigating a lightless space where software development, tribal sovereignty in the California desert, international banking laundering in the Middle East, and hostage negotiations all seemingly collided.
The documentation points to an investigative scope that ultimately consumed his operational capacity.
He was a man with a poet's heart and a boxer's tenacity, who walked straight into a machine designed to crush people exactly like him. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final concept to mull over as you process all of this incredibly dense information. It's the terrifying, almost imperceptible overlap between a genuine organic psychological breakdown and a meticulously executed psychological operation.
The behavioral symptoms of both conditions present identically to an outside observer.
If you are dealing with an intelligence apparatus whose exact funded specialty is psychological warfare, whose operatives, like Joseph Keller, are specifically trained to infiltrate a target's mind, disrupt their sleep for months, feed them calculated paranoia, isolate them from reality, and make them believe the entire world is against them. How can local investigators, or even historians, looking back decades later, ever truly tell the difference? How do you distinguish between a man who is driven to madness by his own obsession with a massive conspiracy theory and a man who is systematically, deliberately driven to his death by the conspirators themselves? If a psychological operation is executed perfectly, the autopsy will always say suicide. Thanks for listening.